To support that, I want to quote a line that is in both the verbal instructions that everyone received before every APFT they took, and identical quote is in the instructions that everyone hears in the verbal instructions right before their ACFT. And the quote is, the results of this test will give you and your commanders an indication of your state of physical readiness and will act as a guide in determining your physical training needs. I wish more people paid attention to that line because I think if you polled the whole Army, APFT era or ACFT era, and asked them, how many times did a leader of yours sit down with you, look at your test results, and say, this is what you're performing well on, this is where your weaknesses are, these are the types of training you should do to improve? I think the answer would be like single digits percentages of people saying, yeah, I got that feedback. I don't think we're doing a good job using results of tests to guide future training, whether it's for individuals or for units.
Team, welcome back to another week with Drew and Drew and Alex this week. No guests. No one wanted to
Just
hang out with
us,
us. Nobody.
one-on-one.
Yeah, one-on-one. Everybody turned us down. Nobody wanted to. I'm kidding. We didn't invite anybody. It's just the two of us. What are we talking about?
Well, today, as we're talking, is June 25th, so it's been 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago, on my birthday, the Army gave me a gift.
Happy birthday. Happy late birthday.
Thanks. The gift the Army gave me was a military.com article with updates sharing average score data on the ACFT for all components broken down by gender. No raw data. They weren't feeling so generous as to give me like actual data we could work with and analyze and things like that. Just a bunch of average scores and some passing rate information and things like that. And this is a trend with the content I make for Instagram. The harder I work on a post, the worse it performs. So the content I can create in like 30 seconds does the best. So I literally, this was the whole process, copy pasted some of the stuff from the military.com article into Canva on top of some pictures of people doing ACFT stuff and posted this data that it had already been out for a week. It wasn't even breaking news. Popped it on Instagram. People went bananas. People are fighting each other in the comments, getting super disrespectful, like saying stuff that if they said it in person, they'd be for sure getting punched in the face. It got heated. People had a lot of opinions. People think certain events should get added to the test, certain events should get removed from the test. But I think the biggest thing for me, and I waded into the comments a little bit. Comment sections are a dangerous space. I've been trying to back off on engaging in comments so much because it never helps anything. But it was clear from a lot of these comments that a lot of misconceptions about how the ACFT was developed, about what the ACFT is supposed to do, about why certain things are the way they are. There's a lot of misconceptions that I thought more of us were past that we clearly are not past. So I thought it might be worth having a
Thought we were
conversation
past
about
this.
it.
Thought we were past this, guys.
So if people know like my workflow on Mops and Mode, like usually I'll create content like in the evening when I got a few minutes or whatever, and then I'll post it in the morning before I go into work, and I'll try to mostly ignore it. But this one was popping. My phone was blowing up, and I think I texted you, Drew, saying like, "Hey,
Hmm.
it's up. Need you to go swing by the comment section and take a look. It's getting a little wild."
Which means I had to log into my computer because I don't have Instagram on my phone. Look at the comment section. And yeah, you guys were. Yeah. Okay, let's dive in.
He does say you guys, and I do think the audiences are a little bit different between Instagram and
That's
the
fair.
podcast, or
Those
between
people.
Facebook and the podcast. Facebook is its own audience, Instagram is its own audience, and the podcast is its own audience. There are overlaps, certainly. I wish I could get more of the people on the social media to listen to the podcast because I think we get a lot more nuanced here. But it is what it is. People want 10-second.
Those people. Those people were fighting on. You people that listen, discerning listeners, you would never have engaged in that sort of debauchery.
No,
So
you're much more mature than that over
much more
here.
mature. You have time. So anyway, what were those people talking about?
Well, before we do that, I kind of want to break down a fun one. This did appear in the comments. I was reminded of it because of a comment. It was not one of the more serious comments. Um, Somebody pointed out that the laterals in the sprint drag carry are kind of stupid. Drew, do you know why there are laterals in the sprint drag carry?
Well, first of all, let's explain terms. The sprint drag carry, for people who don't take the ACFT or don't know what it is, Army Combat
Sure.
Fitness Test, by the way. Uh, Correct me if I'm wrong here. Two kettlebells, you sprint
You're
Down.
already wrong. You're
I'm
already
wrong.
wrong.
Okay. What is the sprint track carry?
It's literally in the name of the event, but
Yep.
it's a 25-meter out and back, so each lap is 50 meters. You
Okay.
do a 50-meter unweighted sprint,
Mm-hmm.
50 meters drag with the sled, which
Mm-hmm.
is 90 pounds, 90-pound drag sled.
You're walking backwards,
Correct. Backwards
right?
sled drag.
Yep.
Then you do 50 meters, no weight again, but this time you do laterals.
Which
You
for
like
folks
shuffle
that don't
sideways.
know is yeah, shuffling sideways.
Yeah, it's a little bit awkward.
It's
Um,
so stupid looking.
you finish your shuffle, then you carry the kettlebells out and back 50 meters, and then you finish it off with a final 50-meter unweighted sprint.
So it's a sprint, drag, carry, shuffle, sprint.
Sprint, drag, shuffle, carry, sprint.
Sprint, drag, shuffle, carry, sprint. That doesn't sound as good.
No, it does not.
Interesting. So the banter is why are there laterals?
Yeah, I want to know if you know why they're there.
Some, what I would assume happened is lab-based study broke down some combat something and decided that you should be able to move sideways.
People would think that, and I wonder if it was briefed early on or anything like that. That is not the case at all. It's for a much more practical reason than that. And longtime ACFT enthusiasts like myself will remember that before even the battalion pilots, when the Army first publicly announced that they were moving towards this ACFT thing, and they didn't even have standards published yet, they just told us what the events were. There were no laterals in the sprint drag carry, and I remember this vividly because it came out when I was at Fort Drum, and being the nerd that I am, I went that day to Atkins Functional Fitness Center and did as many events as I could, including
Oh
like
my
asking the gym
God.
owner if I could take a 10-pound medicine ball outside and just chuck it a few times to see how far I could throw it. Huge nerd, huge nerd. But I do specifically remember that at that time there were no laterals in the sprint drag carry.
I could see you. I just on Instagram the other day, they had a clip of like when one of the Star Wars films came out and everyone was waiting and then they stormed in and they were fighting with lightsabers.
Yeah.
I could see you just waiting at the gate of Fort Drum on like ACFT day and that's just say, "Oh my God, it's not down! Give me the med ball." I could see that. Anyway,
I'm sure people were very confused by what I was doing, like
yeah,
outside in the grass next
I
to
didn't realize
Atkins.
how progress you're ahead of your time.
I was.
But anyway, why are there laterals in the sprint track?
So what happened? They started piloting the test, and a consistent issue was coming up where people would do their sprint just fine, and they would do their sled drag just fine, and they would underestimate the fatigue
We've
that
talked
the
about this.
sled
Yep.
had caused to their legs.
Yep.
And so they would get the sled across the line, let go of it, and attempt to sprint like they were on fresh legs, and they would eat grass. They would go face first into the ground immediately. And this was not a rare occurrence. This was like a very frequent occurrence. So the laterals, along with a slight adjustment to the scoring times, were added to mitigate injury risk of people face planting after their sled drag.
I mean, you could also just let them do that once and then they'd probably never do that again.
You would think so. And you would think that for like a test that, at least in its original incarnation, before politics got involved and changed the whole thing, was specifically designed around making sure people were physically prepared for combat, you would
Hmm.
think that like an awareness of how to move when your legs are fatigued might be relevant, especially after like a casualty drag or something like that.
Nope.
Yeah, I would argue that we could push soldiers a little bit and like expose them to that kind of thing. But no, we had
No,
to add a safety constraint.
that's pretty funny.
Should I start this off by breaking down the key results published in the article for people who have not read it?
Please. And we will undoubtedly link the article in the show notes if you
The
are
article will be linked in the show notes. Some of
so
this will be copy
inclined.
pasted into the show notes. Pretty straightforward because I know nobody, as much as Drew says, like take out a notebook and pencil. I know nobody's taking notes on most
Nobody's
of
doing
this,
that.
so you're not
Mm.
going to remember the string of numbers I'm about to rattle off. But we
If you
can we
do,
can
actually,
point out
hold
some
on.
trends.
If you are sitting there with a notebook and you are writing this down, please take a picture and send it to Mops and Mo's Instagram.
That'd be amazing. I would love to share some pictures of people taking notes as
Taking
they
notes.
listen,
Yeah, please.
especially if it's like in a really scenic like reading nook or like by the
Yeah.
beach or like in the woods on a bench or something like that.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome.
ASMR. Mops and
There you
Mo's
go.
ASMR. Anyway,
There you go.
ACFT numbers.
So I'm not going to do all the numbers in the article. You can go click the link in the notes, read the article for yourself. I would honestly recommend reading the whole article and then coming back to the episode because it'll give you a lot more context. But I'll break down some of the key stuff here. Overall pass rate for all genders and all components, active duty, National Guard, and reserve, over 90, at least 90% or higher. National Guard and reserve women are at 90%. Reserve men and active duty women are at 95%. National Guard men are at 96% pass rate, and active duty men are at 98% pass rate. So there is a discrepancy between men and women in each component of 3 to 6%. And there is a discrepancy between components of like 3% for men and 5% for women between reserve and active duty. Um, I will note, just for listeners who aren't aware of this stuff, if you hear the terms like Compo 1, Compo 2, Compo 3, that is referring to active duty, National Guard, and reserve, respectively. The National Guard has combat arms units in it. The reserve does not. So that's where you would expect to see some of that
Hmm,
discrepancy.
good to know that.
Reserve is all support component stuff. All of your maneuver units are in the National Guard,
Hmm.
with some like odd, really niche exceptions, but that's true for the most part. Um, the other threshold they looked at was percent of soldiers who score 540 and above, that being the score required to be exempt from body composition standards.
Is
And there were
that
slightly bigger discrepancies
did
here.
did 540 mean anything to anybody until the sergeant major decided to make that a number?
I mean, I think just 90 points in each event.
Okay. I just didn't know if it was like prior to him saying that, oh, that's the number. I don't think anybody
There,
cared
I
about
mean,
540s, right?
no, it wasn't like a huge benchmark necessarily. For a long time in like APFT days, 270 and above was a
Okay.
thing. I think that might have been the criteria for the physical fitness badge, the patch people sometimes wore on their shorts. Nobody really took it seriously in any units I was in, and you would have been kind of a nerd for putting that patch in your shorts, to be honest.
Says the guy who
Um,
did all the ACFT events before they were even published. But
yeah,
yeah.
I love all that stuff, but the bar was not high enough for the patch. It wasn't like well respected because everybody got that score. That's part of the problem.
But now if you get a 540, you're exempt from ABCP.
Yeah, so something a lot of people care about it
Yep.
because it allows you to be big and beefy.
Hmm.
And like I said, slightly bigger discrepancies here. Active duty men, highest rate, 29% of active duty men scoring 540 or above. Active duty women, 18% scoring 540 or above. And active duty women actually outscore National Guard and Reserve men here. National Guard men, 11%. National Guard women, 7%. Reserve men, 10%. Reserve women, 6%. So again, bigger discrepancies, still have a discrepancy between men and women, and a dramatic discrepancy between active duty and reserve component.
Hmm.
And then we get one that I did highlight in my post, in the caption and things like that, and highlighted in the post itself. Despite the run being a copy paste event from APFT that a lot of soldiers theoretically would be used to, and despite the run requiring no equipment whatsoever to train for, running was the lowest average score of all the events across all the gender and component categories, to the point that reserve women's 2 mile run average score is supposedly 61 points. We had some good back and forth in the comments with some smart people. If reserve women's scores were normally distributed, that implies that if the pass rate is indeed 90%, the standard deviation of scores for reserve women is like a third of a point. That seems incredibly unlikely that they're clustered that much, where like all of the scores are either like 60, 61, or 62, basically, with like basically none scoring anything else. Many people pointed out they're probably not normally distributed. You would not expect it when you have certain incentives and gates to hit and things like that. So there's probably a bump up around the 540 mark because, well, actually, we got the data right here to dispel that. 6% of reserve women score 540 or above. That makes it essentially statistically impossible that the average is 61 points if 6% are over 540. Like assuming any kind of reasonable distribution, that's essentially impossible. Not completely impossible. It would technically be possible for like a cluster of 6% to be exactly at the other end. but I would love to see the raw data on that one.
Yeah, I don't think that's gonna happen.
It's a little weird. I don't think we're getting raw data. That seems unlikely. My FOIA instincts are itching, but I'm guessing it would get shut down on like revealing too much readiness data or something like that. There's probably a FOIA exemption that prevents them from having to release that information.
Heaven
We'll see.
forbid.
So Drew, what of the many hot topics that popped up in the comments do you think we should dig into?
Let's do the 2 mile run.
That was a hot one. That was possibly the hottest one.
I have strong feelings about the run piece. I'm curious where this
Yeah,
goes.
so we saw all sorts of suggestions. We saw people saying we should eliminate the run. We saw people saying we should do like a 400 or an 800 or something.
Can I just
We
say
saw.
something? If you think we should eliminate the run in any fitness test, you're an idiot.
I'm gonna go ahead and agree with you, and I think we're gonna
You
have to
are
break this down a little
stupid.
bit for
You
people.
are
Like it.
stupid and you should stop talking.
Well, let's address the most common argument. The most common reason people think the run should be discarded, and I will use their words. I've never run 2 miles in combat, so why is it on the
Yeah,
test?
that means you're an idiot if you think that's an argument that can be made. You're an idiot. And
I
actually,
I kind of
you wrote a
wish
blog post on this.
I did write a blog post on it. I kind of wish Drew would just show up in the comment sections talking like that. I think it'd
It's
be
not like
amazing.
I almost did totally unrelated to this one. I almost did the other day in something else. Like I was yearning for it, but like, okay,
On a
yeah,
mops and most thing or something else.
no, it was the one you sent me. I forget the account, but it was the guy that was progressing 5%.
Oh yeah. The program that called for progressing weights 5% every week.
Yeah, just also an idiot. Stupid. People are so stupid. Anyway, so break the run. Let's do the run. Let's do the run.
So let's again, I'll link it in the show notes because there's a whole blog post on this one. But I think there's a few key points to make on the 2 mile run issue. And a core overarching one that is important to the whole ACFT is that the ACFT is not and never was designed to be a simulation of combat. I have talked about the baseline soldier physical readiness requirements study, aka the BISPERS, a million times in this podcast. We've even had Dr. DeGroot come on the podcast and talk about it, and we had Dr. East come on the podcast and talk about it, both authors of the BISPERS report. I know people aren't going to go read it. That's fine. But I need you to take away like at least some key things about it. And one is that, well, the ACFT is designed to be predictive of performance on combat tasks, or at least it was designed that way. Politics have changed things a little bit, but I'm not in an official capacity right now, so I don't have to play those games. Um, Combat simulations were, so I guess they started with bringing subject matter experts in with lots of combat experience, lots of exercise science experience, all that stuff to figure out what are some good representative tasks for combat that simulate either the most common things that happen in combat or the most severe things that happen in combat. Because you got to have a combination of both. If something's rare but extremely severe, you have to address that. Or something's not so severe but extremely common, you have to address that too. So they discussed what those things are that happen in combat that are the most physically demanding. Then they put together like what are the most common components of fitness in those things, and they put together some simulation tasks they could do. Yes, they did execute combat task simulation. They did it multiple times at multiple bases with multiple study populations, but we weren't trying to create a test that was a simulation. We were trying to use field expedient standardized assessments that predict performance on those simulations. So we're one step removed from an actual combat simulation with this test. No, they don't think you're going to chuck 10 pounds backwards over your head in the middle of combat, but they also don't think you're going to stumble across a bunch of hex bars and kettlebells on the battlefield. Like none of these things are direct combat simulations. They are testing a component of fitness that has been demonstrated to influence your performance on those combat tasks. Did that make sense, Drew?
Yeah. Two thoughts. One, as an example, not many, well, I've watched a lot of football. I've never seen anyone bench press on the football field, but it's part of the combine. Why? Because upper body strength endurance is important if you're going to play football. Second thing that comes to mind, the Army has done a horrible job marketing what you just said because I think for the layman, the standard soldier or hater, whatever, when you lay that out, all they hear is the word combat and simulation, and they
Sure.
think, well, it is a simulation. And that's where you get these idiots saying, I've never run 2 miles in combat. And I'm going to get so much hate for this. I'm going to get so much hate for this, but I'll say it anyway. If you're the person in the comments saying that, you've probably never been in combat because everyone that we've talked to who's actually done combat like excessively, they all talk about aerobic base building, being more aerobic, doing more running, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I'm intentionally saying that to like cause a shitstorm, so feel free to rip me apart, but just stop making that argument.
It's pretty bad. And so bringing it full circle. Well, before I bring it full circle back to the run, I'll point out 2 points I made in the blog post. And you talked about the layman and how they perceive it. And the Army, you are correct, did screw up the marketing a little bit. There were some videos produced that tried to show like side by side
Well, they
ACFT
literally on the
deadlift and
website,
then
yeah,
picking up a litter.
on the website for the ACFT, unless it's changed, it's like,
Ooh,
has it changed? Because
unless it's changed.
the hex bar deadlift, and then you have the dude lifting the litter, and then you have the
So
freaking,
you you are correct that that was on the website.
did
It
they change
was.
it?
It certainly was. That content was all there. I will acknowledge that it was there, and that was a lot of the messaging was like showing how this connects to combat stuff to make it believable for people. You'll note that if you go back there now for both scientific and political reasons, all that stuff is gone. The simulation, like all that stuff, it's gone. Now it talks about what it's testing,
No, it's
components
just
of
a
fitness,
pose
all
running
that kind of stuff.
website.
We don't have time for that. That's a separate episode. um, so it's all about components of fitness. But
Sure.
the point I made in the blog article is that there are different kinds of validity. And when you mentioned the term like lay observer who doesn't want to get into the science and who doesn't want to nerd out and listen to an hour long podcast about this stuff, what they're going to be concerned with is something called face validity. If you show the test to a random person, are they going to believe that it tests what it's supposed to test? That's what face validity is. You're not going to like face validity on a scientific sense. Like it's not important. Like scientists wouldn't worry about face validity. They would worry about a bunch of other types of validity, namely construct validity in this case. But when you have to sell a test to an organization largely composed of people who aren't going to approach this scientifically, face validity does matter to a certain degree. Um, we'll talk about it with other events in a second, but the 2 mile run doesn't have a ton of face validity for people who are thinking about combat simulations because you're probably not going to go for a 2 mile jog in combat. But what the 2 mile run is testing is aerobic capacity. It's a well validated, field expedient, simple zero equipment way to test aerobic capacity. And aerobic capacity is a determining factor in your ability to sustain workload over time and to recover from bouts of high intensity effort and all these things. It's absolutely crucial in just about any combat situation you can describe. We need to test that component of fitness. It's important. There's other face validity issues. For example, the sprint drag carry, which we were discussing earlier, has fantastic face validity. People see how it relates to combat. They get the intensity thing, they get the carrying thing, they get the dragging thing, they get the sprinting thing. They can see how it is relevant to a bunch of combat stuff. But from a construct validity standpoint, I think it has challenges. For example, people could struggle with the sprint drag carry for totally different reasons, and it's not going to tell us what they need to train because it's not testing any one particular component of fitness. It's testing too many things at the same time and blurring them together. So you could have a big, strong guy who lacks anaerobic capacity or whatever you want to call that, because Drew doesn't like the word anaerobic, but lacks that kind of work capacity. And they might be plenty strong. They just need to work on the capacity. And then somebody else could get the same time as them struggling on the event as well. But it might be somebody very small who lacks the lower body strength for the sled drag. And an assessment should give you good information about how to train. So if it's not telling you which component of fitness you're struggling with, it might not be an ideal assessment.
All I'm thinking as you're saying this is the test could have just been a deadlift and a run.
So we've had this conversation before. I don't know if we've had it on the podcast. We definitely had it offline, but you would capture most of it with just a deadlift and a run.
Like, I'm curious what the correlation, maybe they have the that. Like, what is the correlation between deadlift and sprint track carry
I have to go find,
or like
hold
run
on.
blank?
I think I already have up in my browser because I was checking which windows I already had open before this conversation. I think somewhere here I have. the Rand study um, that broke down like which events had the most predictive value. Let me see if I can get to the spot. Um, for for three fitness events, no, that's
Predictive
not the right
value of what?
paragraph.
Of what though?
No, like part of the Rand study, they broke down like which events had the most predictive value for results on the combat simulations.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I guess, yeah, it's fine.
and I think, but it was four events to get to like the vast majority of the predictive value. The deadlift was on there, the run was on there. I think the standing power throw was on there.
Fine. Keep the power throw.
And maybe the sprint drag carry was the fourth one.
I don't think you need a sprint track carry. I think, I mean, you have it in here. This is a little bit off the rails, but you have in here the different run distances for the different branches. I have said this for years, and I maintain that one of the reasons the Marine Corps is the fittest branch is because they have a 3 mile run. Like you
So there's,
can't,
I think there's a strong argument to be made for running a little bit more. And like people, I haven't dug through all my messages from today because I posted about some other stuff. Um, but there were for sure some discussion there of like what would be the point of extending it to a 3 mile run, since the correlation isn't really that different in terms of VO2 max. Um, I do think, and we could probably do a whole episode about this later. I haven't gone deep enough into the research. I think the obsession with VO2 max lately, because it started to pop up on a bunch of other
it's
like
obnoxious.
sciencey podcasts and stuff like that. I think we're overdoing it. I think we're making the measurable important rather than making the important measurable. Nobody's having conversations about like lactate threshold two, lactate
Uh,
threshold, like whatever. It's just because VO2 max has been tested a lot and studied a lot, and there's a ton of literature about it. I don't think VO2 max is like the king metric that we've made it out to be necessarily. Um, I do think the conversation becomes like what kind of training does it incentivize? Yada yada yada.
a 3 mile?
Sure.
Well, that's my, I think the standard, like a 2 mile run is, I guess, better than a 1.5, which is what the Air Force does.
Depends on
But
your
it's,
definition of better. Because people will point to, and there has been a bunch of validation research done in military populations, and you're not going to like this, Drew. The 1.5 mile had the best correlation with VO2 max
I don't give a shit
out
about
of the one
VO2
and a half,
max
the two,
though.
and the three. I know that's the problem.
VO2 max is a 1 rep max back squat for your lungs. Like how relevant is 1 rep max anything? It's
For
not.
sure. But what people like if you dig into like DODI 13.3, which is the DOD instruction that directs all the services to have these tests, they've essentially and there's some really funny notes about this. I'll link the public health report in the show notes and you can dive into it if you want. It's a couple hundred pages long, so you're probably not going to read the whole thing, but
A couple hundred. Yeah, probably
how
not.
it shows how a bunch of experts responded to like these TRADOC RFIs like years before the ACFT about like fairness of testing and things like that. And some of these experts did not hold back on their thoughts. But the DoD instruction mandates the services to test, if I'm not mistaken, strength, muscular endurance, and aerobic capacity, pretty much. And the implicit understanding at the time it was published, I'm not sure this is specifically stated in the DoD instruction, is that their definition of aerobic capacity or cardio, they probably use the term cardiorespiratory endurance,
Was
actually.
VO2 max.
I think they mean VO2 max. So all the
And
tests were
that's why I don't
backwards.
listen to them.
They were all reverse engineered from VO2 max. And you got
Right.
to understand this was like Cooper Institute era. Like this is
Yeah,
when everybody's hyped on
exactly.
that stuff. But some of the experts pointed out that all the DoD services up until the ACFT were technically in violation of that DoD instruction because none of the services tested strength. Like a push
No,
up
that's fair. I
max reps
think
is not a test of strength. And like the experts pointed that out. Like the Navy is in violation of this. The Air Force is in violation of this. The DoD said test strength and you don't. So there's a fun little bit of
I
historical
just
drama
think
there.
it's
But
all like, listen, listen. Who gives a shit if your PT test looks like combat? Like we have obstacle courses for that. If you
yeah.
want to go around and play gimmicky combat games, go do an obstacle course. You want to figure out, I mean, this is what a PT test is for, right? Are you fit? Cool. Okay. By that definition, the harder the event, the more fitter your passing people will be. So I would just
Mm.
say do a 3 mile run and a heavy deadlift, and that's it.
I mean, it's not a
Done.
bad idea, and it would probably do a lot of the explanatory value.
I think the reason why shit like that doesn't fly is because one, companies can't make money off of the equipment that they have to sell the military, and two, congressmen and women who don't exercise well, if at all, can't like massage the shit out of this thing until it becomes this like political nightmare.
Well, let's discuss a point you just made that I disagree with.
Please,
You said, "What's the point of a fitness assessment? Say how fit you are." And I think there's more to it than that. I think fitness assessments serve multiple purposes.
please enlighten me.
And I've gone back and forth. I think I sent you a link to Chris Frankel's presentation at TSAC last year, and we're going to get him on the podcast. He has agreed to come on. We just got to schedule it. We will do a whole episode on the many purposes of assessments. But the core purposes that I worry about, like if I'm creating physical fitness assessments for an organization I'm supporting, I'm thinking about one, it should measure fitness, but more specifically, it should measure relevant components of fitness to whatever goal performance you have. I think that you and I probably agree on just fine. It shouldn't be like a random definition of fitness. It should be supportive of whatever goal you expect them to perform on.
Maybe.
I'm not going to test shot putters on a 3 mile run.
No, that's yeah,
That
but
would be dumb.
shot putters have a very discrete
Yes.
event,
And that's
so they
and
can
that's
get
what we're
a
talking about, relevant components of fitness. And it does get harder in the military to define
right,
which
exactly.
components and how relevant they are because it's more broad. So we have to go more broad with the test. 100% still right. I'm still with you. We're
Okay.
good on that. I think the test should also, the results of the test should be useful in making training decisions. How you perform on the event or how you perform on the events, plural, should be like directly usable in making decisions about future training. And to support that, I want to quote a line that is in both the verbal instructions that everyone received before every APFT they took, and identical quote is in the instructions that everyone hears in the verbal instructions right before their ACFT. And the quote is, the results of this test will give you and your commanders an indication of your state of physical readiness and will act as a guide in determining your physical training needs. I wish more people paid attention to that line because I think if you pulled the whole Army, APFT era or ACFT era, and asked them, how many times did a leader of yours sit down with you, look at your test results, and say, this is what you're performing well on, this is where your weaknesses are, these are the types of training you should do to improve? I think the answer would be like single digits percentages of people saying, yeah, I got that feedback. I don't think we're doing a good job using results of tests to guide future training, whether it's for individuals or for units.
But I don't disagree with you. I will be cynical though and say that guides future training to such an extent that it then improves the test. Like
Sure.
you should be training holistically,
Well,
hybridy, whatever you want to call it,
that
all the
brings me to the
time.
third thing I am concerned with physical assessments for units if I'm developing stuff, which is that we know that the assessment creates powerful incentives for how to train. Like
Exactly.
despite what we discuss on this podcast about train for the component of fitness rather than the event, people very much train for the test. So acknowledging that that is an unavoidable reality, we should create assessments that incentivize the types of training we want them to do.
So you should do a heavy deadlift and you should run for a long time. Because if you train for those two things, like, okay, the reason I say that is because the sprint track carry, like, if you suck at the sprint track carry, it's probably a skill thing. Because if you are a fat, I don't, my point is, I don't think you'll find somebody who sucks at the sprint track carry who's awesome at a 3 mile run. And if you do, it's going to be the rare Eliud Kipchoge type who, like, okay, like fair play, you run ultra marathons. Like, yeah,
Sure.
we should probably get you a little stronger.
But how would you solve that? You'd insert something into the test like a 300-yard shuttle.
Sure. And I would take this a step further and say my ideal test would be a 400-meter sprint, deadlift, 3 mile run.
Sure. But like we're backwards, like we're backing our way back into the ACFT at this point almost.
Well, we haven't got any sprint track carries in there yet. We're not moving
No,
laterally
and
yet.
we agree that sprint track carry has too many things in it to be a useful assessment. But I think I would, instead of the 400-meter sprint, although that would work just fine, I wouldn't have issues with it. I would pick the 300-yard shuttle, partly because I think it takes, yes, it does blur a tiny bit of change of direction stuff into it and other things, but I like it from the standpoint of you have to like make the decision to try hard 12 separate times.
Well, we used to do it. The protocol I used with pararescue was the 300, rest 5 minutes, do it
That's
again.
what I was going to say. That's exactly what I
Yeah.
was going to say.
And you compare the two. Yeah, you compare the two. That will ruin your day.
Yes. So we agree there. Deadlift, the 2 rep 300-yard shuttle run with a constrained break between the two, where your score is the average of the two. Yes, I dig it. Now we get into, do you need more events than that?
No, no, you don't.
This is me. You know who you're talking to. I would love to see some kind of pull-up type of event in there, whether it's a leg tuck or a pull-up or a chin-up or whatever you choose, for the sake of, I think there is value to strength to weight ratio in your assessment. You do kind of capture that by having both a deadlift, which rewards being big, and a run, which rewards being small. But I still like having some kind of strength to weight ratio event in there. And I like the idea of incentivizing upper body pulling for a force that has way overemphasized upper body pushing for decades.
So do a rope climb.
I would love it, but like ropes are annoying to maintain.
Oh,
Injury
I'm
risk becomes a
sorry. Having a
thing.
whole freaking ACFT kit is easy to
Sure.
maintain?
No, that's
Absolutely
fair.
not.
That's a fair criticism.
Throw a
But
rope up.
again, I was just talking to this. Shout out Nate. I've shouted you out in this podcast a ton of times. It's probably gonna be more now. But
Nate Palin?
yeah, Nate Palin. We talked
Okay.
about it. The rope climb falls into the same trap as the sprint drag carry of, you don't know the reason they are struggling with it if they're struggling. They might be strong enough and lack the technique. They might like it might be
Yes,
a grip
yes, that's
issue. It might be
fair.
an upper body strength issue.
But
It's a fuzzy event.
getting better at a rope climb makes you a better human than getting better at a sprint drag carry.
Why not just do pull-ups then?
Fine, that's fine. Do pull-ups. But I think that like the quote unquote athletic nature of rope climb promotes a different person than just somebody who can crank out pull-ups.
It's true. And I do get sad because I go out to a lot of army bases randomly, and a lot of them have like
Ropes
poorly
everywhere.
maintained.
Ropes.
No, a lot of them have ropes everywhere because you spend a lot of time at Liberty. Liberty has ropes everywhere
I
and they
got
are well maintained.
a ton of ropes right outside my office.
If I go around to other bases, I find ropes that are extremely poorly maintained, fraying, falling apart, or gone, and they just gave up on them. And there's like the like whatever stub that it hooked onto hanging up there, sadly blowing around in the wind, reminding you that the army didn't care enough to have ropes for people to train on. Do I think that rope climbing is like a terribly relevant tactical task? No, not really.
Oh, I would
Um,
disagree.
I
Oh,
don't
I would
think it comes
disagree
up that
so hard.
much.
Look at like, okay, a couple examples. 10th Mountain guy we had on, your favorite division. They're climbing
Sure.
ropes. Hacksaw Ridge, he's doing
They're not
ropes.
they're not climbing ropes. They are not
101st,
climbing ropes.
101st Airborne
Just
coming out
because
of
ropes
helicopters.
because
Ropes.
ropes are involved in safety does not mean you are climbing ropes.
I know, but
I
again, training towards a rope climb, familiarization with an implement, way more relevant than can you go lateral and then carry some kettlebells and then drag this freaking sled?
and I do appreciate the coordination
I
element
hope
of
people are
good
just
rope climbing.
slamming their dashboards right now, like these fucking guys.
No, I obviously love rope climbing. Like I love it,
Yeah,
but like I don't know if it fits in a fitness test because it's almost becoming a skill test rather than a test of
sure.
actual fitness.
But the skill, like I think again, you could make the like, okay, here, then you should have to go tread water for an hour. Like we could make this ridiculous. I get that. But
Mm,
I think that there is room for some skill stuff. I just prefer skills that have a global impact versus skill just for the skill. Like the
sure, and
freaking med
I
ball
think we have a
toss.
good example of that we probably agree on. You already just said it, the standing power throw. The idea is to assess power. I think we have probably enough literature. Like, yes, power is an important component of performance on combat tasks. It shows up in several of them, but power correlates really closely with strength. I
Yep,
think
exactly.
your deadlift is going to predict most of your standing power throw. And the standing power throw, and I went back and read like 3 or 4 of the papers on bomb throw, backwards overhead mid ball throw. It's been studied in firefighters, it's been studied in football players, it's been studied in a range of populations. And each of those studies does identify that there was a strong learning effect. If you just
Hmm.
keep assessing somebody on it over and over again, they get significantly better because they are developing the skill of the movement, which means the best way to train for it is to do the actual thing, which is not what we want to incentivize.
Yeah. And so go out to any military installation, any army installation, and you see people just hucking med balls.
But that same thing applies to rope climbing. I see your argument that rope climbing will transfer better to other things,
Yeah.
but you're falling into the same trap of it's a pretty skill based thing.
I'm just saying, go canvas the population of people who can climb a rope. I guarantee a higher percentage of those humans are what you would envision a war fighter looking like versus who can huck a med ball over their head.
That's fair. That's probably the quote I'm going to use for the intro of the
That's
episode.
fine. It's like, okay, there's 100 people that can throw a med ball. There's 100 people that can climb a rope. You rope climbers, you all look pretty good. You med ball tossers look like some of y'all look good. Some of y'all just came outside for the first time in a while.
That's Alec Blennis had a post a while back about like show me someone who can do a really heavy like barbell hip thrust and I don't know
Oh
anything
yeah.
about their overall athleticism and fitness. Show
Yep.
me somebody who can do like a really heavy weighted lunge and I know that person is like a
Exactly.
warrior. Like certain activities do,
Hmm.
and that's a hard one to study. That's a hard one to get real data on.
Yeah, but
But
we've already established the sports science industry sucks when it comes to producing relevant studies. And that's no hate. I think some of them would agree with me. But
what was the one I sent you a little while ago? Was it like can like bar speed on a hang power clean predict 1 rep max high
power,
pull?
something like that. Yeah.
Like, and
Just
like,
shit no one cares about.
if the authors who worked on that study are listening to the podcast, sorry, it's probably really interesting research, but it's not going to help anybody make better training decisions.
And that's fine. Like, truthfully, just the nature of the way PhDs are constructed, people have to produce shitty research to produce research because that's the requirement. Hey, did you publish a paper? Cool, great, awesome. Does anyone care? No. Which is why I think,
Drew has a vendetta against people doing the hip thrust versus back squat
I just think that,
papers.
like, yeah, I just think that we should allow more room for the eye test when it comes
Yeah,
to
that's
like an
fair.
effective fitness that, like, again, congressionally, could we defend a rope climb versus, oh, Dr. such and such studied the sprint drag carry and the construct face validity bullshit. Like, who cares? You should have to first of all be able to do the event before you can commentate on it. And then there should be an eye test. And that's where you go back. Like, I don't know, Dr. Reese could probably help us with this one, but like with PT test, I always go back to like when were we the most combat effective? Well, it was like World War I, World War II, like, go back. They weren't waiting for scientists to tell them like that's a good PT test. They were like, "Hey, fucker, climb the rope, and if you can't, you're not jumping out of airplanes in Normandy." Like, when did sorry, I'm like on a soapbox, but like, where did that go?
No, you're not wrong. You're not wrong.
I don't know. We're off the rails.
We're off the rails. Should I bring us back onto the rails?
Sure. This all
We're gonna
started
start
because we were talking
changing
about 2 mile
topics.
runs in
We
combat.
did. People listening to this podcast are probably going to assume we had no plan for this episode. We did, in
I
fact,
never
have
know
like,
what soundbite you're going to use for the intro until I listen to the episode and I'm like, oh, there's me sounding like a douche.
well, we had like an extensive notes document here, and we've gotten like really caught up in the first bullet point on our notes sheet, and we haven't gone through anything else.
That's fine.
Um, so I'll do some stuff that's probably less contentious that can get us back on the rails and will hopefully be useful for people. Um, well, no, I'm going to go down another rabbit hole. I'm going to ask Drew.
I,
Drew,
yeah.
what would you consider a good ACFT score?
I mean, 600.
I mean, 600 is clearly exceptional. There's not that many 600s happening. I think it's hard to argue that somebody who can run a 2 mile that fast and produce all those results and those other things is very fit. But if you had to come up with like yeah, you're doing good in your fitness, where's that threshold? Like it's not
Like,
as high as
okay,
that.
you're doing good on your fit.
Yeah.
Probably 540. I mean, 540 is just as good as any other number.
Okay.
90 on each, I
That's,
think.
yeah. And I think I generally agree that like 540 is a pretty good threshold to saying like you're doing good. I would
Well, what is
have to
good?
look
Like,
at
that's my rabbit
that's
hole,
the hard question. We don't
you
really know what
know?
good is.
Like,
But
what's
I would
good?
say before I can like put my stamp of approval on 540, I would probably have to look up different age and gender categories to make sure there's not like huge cliffs we're dropping off for standards and stuff. But I would point out that there's some edge cases that I worry about, right? If somebody can max the deadlift, the power throw, the push-ups, the sprint drag carry, and the plank, they can proceed to run a 22-minute 2 mile and still score a 540 and be exempt from body composition standards because they're supposedly so fit that we don't need to worry about it. I would argue that 540, actually, no, that's not true because I believe the body composition exemption policy requires a minimum of 80 in each event, even though it's a 90 average. So I guess your 2 mile run would have to be whatever the 80 point threshold is. I think that's somewhere around the 1630. So maybe we're doing okay. Maybe we're doing okay for the exemption on body composition standards. But I do worry that there's going to be too many people focusing on all the other events to the detriment of their aerobic capacity, because you can just focus on getting big and strong and crush all those other events and not really worry about aerobic capacity at all. That's my only concern on establishing what
Which
the good
is
score is.
why I think this is going to be a total can of worms. There should be a floating army-wide score. There shouldn't be a fixed score. You should, like, as the force gets
Mm.
fitter, the score should go up. And conversely, if the force is getting less fit, the score should trend down. And that could serve as a warning sign of like, hey guys, I've done that on a small scale with special operations. You use like basically Z scores.
Hmm.
And so as people like, because then it's not a question of did I meet the standard because the standard was just a line in the sand. Because to take it a step further, like a standard assumes that there's a one like 0 or 1 difference between good enough and not good enough. And I don't think you can make that like I don't know what the push-up
True.
number is for pass
Yeah.
fail, but like who gives a shit if it's 19 push-ups or 20? But if
Well,
it's
I think the problem you're going to
floating,
run into, and this appeared in the comments on this post, so it's worth bringing up now, is that that works in highly intrinsically motivated populations.
well,
So
what do you
if
want in
you're
the
in,
army? Do you want an intrinsically motivated population? Like at some
I,
point we got to bite the
there's a
bullet.
practicality conversation because if you go look in those comments, you will find tons of people, active duty, National Guard, and reserve, different kinds of units, combat, non-combat, whose leadership, not just they individually, but whose leadership encouraged them to perform poorly during the pilot phase of the ACFT to make sure that the Army sets score thresholds low.
Yeah,
Like
and those
their
fuckers
leadership told
would
them,
get
if you try hard, it's only going to hurt us later because the standards are going to be higher. Don't do anything more. And like the score thresholds, and even if you ignore all of that, when the pilot phase was done, policy was specifically put in place in the Army that you could not use ACFT scores on people's evaluations. You could not give them awards for it, and you could
you
not punish
should
them
be
for it.
able to.
This you can now that the test is in
Yeah.
place, but during the pilot phase,
Yeah,
you
no, I
could
remember
not.
that. Yeah.
And the result is that all the data we collected to decide what the scoring standards should be was collected when there was no punishment for poor performance and no reward for high performance. I think that skewed the data pretty hard.
Right, which is why if you had a floating for people that don't understand what I'm saying, basically you would have, and this would require a lot of infrastructure.
It would require transparency on scoring as well. You'd have to
Right.
like,
Basically, it would
yeah,
require all good things, which is why it'll never happen. But what you would do is all of your scores would feed into a common system, and then statistics would come into play, and the score would float. So, like when
hmm,
it's Alex's day to take his PT test, maybe there's like a 24-hour delay or whatever. Like you would be able to see, okay, today's Army, this is what is considered, I don't know, gold, silver, bronze, passing, failing, however you want to do it.
you just literally described ACFT 3.0. Do you know that?
No, I didn't know that was a thing.
So if people remember the implementation phase of
What
the
are we
ACFT,
on
like
right now? 2.0?
I
4.0?
don't think we have a number anymore.
Oh, she
But
gave
it's
up.
probably called 4.0 or 4.5 or something. Who knows? But in the early days, we had ACFT 1.0, which was only leg tuck, no plank, gender age neutral, one scoring scale. There you go. Then we got, and I don't remember when, I don't know if, no, like fully gender and age norm scoring didn't come until 4.0. ACFT 2.0, some scores were adjusted. I don't think the plank got introduced during 2.0. I think 2.0 might have just been a scoring adjustment and some like minor updates and things like that. Maybe that's where the laterals got added to the sprint dry carry. Who knows? Um, and then ACFT 3.0, by this point, I know for sure the leg tuck was still a thing, but the plank was an option.
Mm.
And scoring was still gender neutral, kind of. And what I mean by that is everybody had the same passing standard, regardless of your MOS, your age, your gender. Everybody had the same passing standard. Um, Going back a little bit, in ACFT 1.0, it was also gold, gray, black, but depending on your
Ah,
MOS, you had
yes.
higher standards. Um, for this one, everybody had the same passing standard, but for evaluations, for like determinations on promotion and things like that, what would go on your evaluation form was your performance as a percentile of your demographic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what we should do.
So like everybody had, like we agree on a passing standard that like you can be a soldier, you're safe to go to combat. And then when you get evaluated, you're in the 70th percentile. And like there's a lot of conversation about what would go into demographic.
It
If you look
doesn't
at the
have to.
briefing
Why
products, it
does there
would
need to be
include
conversation?
Well, the question is, do you separate demographics by gender?
Sure.
In ACFT 3.0, it was separated by gender. So it'd be like, hey, your score doesn't go on your evaluation that the promotion board sees. What goes on there is you were in the 73rd percentile of women in whatever MOS
Hmm.
and maybe rank as well as like an indirect capture of age or something like that. And I think that would have worked really well. The problem
That's
with it,
perfect.
I think it is perfect. It describes what you just said. I think it solved
Yeah.
all the problems. I don't think people understood it. And
So,
I do think there might have been some challenges in like validating and providing quarterly or live updates of what those floating averages were. But I think we could have solved that with some like pretty simple software.
yeah, Excel. It's
I
called
know.
Excel.
I can
I've built
relax.
this on Excel. It's just frustrating because you create whatever we're on 4.0, 5.0, and they're bitching about, oh, gender norm not, what's the standard? It's like you could do what you just said and you could break it down however you wanted. So I could, here's me, soldier X, log into the system. Here's how I stack up against my gender, my age range, my rank, my MOS, all of it. And it floats so that if as the Army, they want to see a return on investment for all these programs they're doing. Well, hypothetically, if H2F is working well, you would see that ACFT score float up. So the minimum would get dragged up with it. And so all of a sudden, you don't have like all these nincompoops out there trying to hit the bare minimum because we just arbitrarily decided the line in the sand is what the minimum is. Like, no, no, your MOS is getting fitter because your MOS gives a shit. You suck because you're at the bottom whatever percentile. Like I get annoyed because it solves literally every problem and it's so easy. It is a formula in
Yeah.
Excel.
Yeah. I
It's
get
so
it.
easy.
I don't think the formula is the hard part. I think making sure good data is flowing into the formula might be slightly a challenge and deciding how transparent to be about it. Like, does that float happen constantly every time a score is
Yeah,
inputted, or does it update quarterly based on X number of inputs?
it should
I don't know.
happen real time.
I think it'd be cool if it was real time. I just don't know if
Why
the army
shouldn't it
is
be
ready
real
for
time?
that.
I think truthfully, the issue is people in positions of power who can make decisions don't want to look bad.
I mean,
And
that's
when
reality.
you
Yes.
create a more complex testing environment where scores actually mean something and can change things, they're like, to your point, you better not fucking perform well because that means the standard is going to be higher. It's like you
Yeah,
are an asshole.
that's fair.
We're
Okay.
just getting heated on here.
You're getting more heated than I expected. I did
I
not
because
expect this heat.
it's just annoying.
Okay. We're
Just
going to get
annoying.
it back on the rails slightly. I'm going to provide a quick newsflash update, and then I'm going to ask you another question, Drew. Beep, 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 beep. There we go. Breaking news. For those who aren't tracking, and I have posted about this before on social media, higher combat standards are coming. So people who are in the comments saying like this isn't high enough for infantrymen, whatever, that passed required in the 2024 NDAA. And to be clear on the language, I went back and read it before we recorded this episode. It's not that it must be announced no later than June 2025. It must be implemented by June 2025. So the higher combat standards must be in effect by this time next year. So whatever phase in period they have to have, they should be announcing this stuff kind of soon, I would hope, to be honest. Now the language is a little fuzzy, and there was a little bit of debate about this in this year's NDAA process, which has not passed yet, so things could change, but it got voted down. It did not make it out of committee. I think it was Representative Waltz suggested that they change the language to explicitly say it must be gender neutral. Right now, the law does not say it must be gender neutral, but there's also nothing preventing them from making it gender neutral. So the Army could decide that these higher combat standards are going to be gender neutral. We don't know. Um, there's also the list of MOSs considered combat that was in that language. I would imagine that list will evolve slightly as the Army's legislative liaisons do their work with Congress, just to be a little bit more of a complete list and clarify some things. But I'm hoping we get news pretty soon on what those higher combat standards are that we can expect next summer are going to be.
You want to know something? The
Sure.
whole spiel I went on solves for that.
Yeah, I know. Don't worry about it. Yes, we if we went back to the ACFT 3.0 thing and did the floating averages
If we
thing,
did the Z
yes,
scores,
we
it's
wouldn't
done.
need it. I got it.
Done.
I understand. Um, so Drew, I got a question for you.
Please.
Forget all our proposed modifications, whatever, whatever.
Our rope climb test.
Take the ACFT as it is. How much slower should your 2 mile run time be after completing all of those preceding ACFT events than if you did it unfatigued?
How much slower should it be or will it be?
Either or, you choose.
I mean, the should one you would hope like not at all, but that's make believe.
Yes.
Will it be? I don't know. A little bit. You want like a specific number? I don't know.
So
30
I'll
seconds.
throw out some specific numbers and
Were
I'll ask for
people
your
were
thoughts
people
on them.
yelling about this?
There were people in the comments saying they had to do like weeks and weeks of like specialized training to even pass at a 23-minute standard when on the APFT they were getting it in like 16 minutes.
Wait a
Um,
second.
I I think
People
those
were
people got
mad because they had to get fitter.
don't I mean first off don't worry about it. But second off, I think those people probably got really out of shape during COVID and don't want to acknowledge that. That's a separate conversation. From what I'm aware of, and I don't have great references on this, these are secondhand things. I think Dr. East might have mentioned some of this on his episodes. That's a pretty good source. But I think when they went and tested Ranger Regiment during the piloting, they saw only like a 30 to 40-second delta between APFT 2 miles and ACFT 2 miles. The problem you run into is that the people with the best aerobic capacity are going to see the least impact on their 2 mile from the preceding events. So that means the fastest runners will see the least impact on their 2 mile, and the slowest runners will see the most impact on their 2 mile. So I
Yeah.
guess relatively reasonable to see at least a minute, maybe 2 minutes. But if we're starting to edge into the like 3 to 4 minutes slower because of the preceding events, I think we've actually run into one of the hidden benefits of the ACFT having too many events on it, which is that it starts to test a separate component of fitness, which is like work capacity slash ability to recover from a bunch of things. And that's a super combat relevant
Oh
component of
yeah.
fitness that's like under research because it's hard to define.
Hmm.
So I would suggest if you're losing a lot of time on your 2 mile because of the sprint drag carry coming before it and stuff, you probably need to work on your aerobic capacity anyway. That'll help you overall. But there might also be a work capacity issue with the way you are training. If like 3 reps of a deadlift, a minute and a half of some anaerobic stuff, some push-ups, some planking, whatever is enough volume to you that you are getting to the 2 mile like super smoked, that is the test working. That is the test finding a gap in your fitness. That's my stance on that one.
Yeah, I mean, you're out of shape. That's just what it is. It's not the test's
It,
fault.
yeah, poor aerobic capacity
It's your
punishes you
fault.
twice on the ACFT. You
Hmm.
have to do the run, which is a test of aerobic capacity, but also you're going to struggle to recover from the other events, which makes the run even worse.
Yeah.
But I'm not opposed to that. I think that's a fine thing.
It's like triathlon. I mean, you get off the bike and you run, and they practice getting off the bike and running because that's important, just as you should practice doing things before you run because that's the test.
Okay. I'm looking over some comments I copy pasted from all the social media
I was gonna
backlash
say,
stuff.
well, what were people mad about?
I'm gonna skip to one and just ask you a question again. Drew, is the ACFT CrossFit?
I mean, no, yes.
So I simmered on this question for a little while.
What a dumb question.
I mean, it's a little bit
Sorry.
dumb. I think my immediate thought is people saying that the ACFT is CrossFit is a huge compliment to CrossFit.
Like, yeah, but what does that mean? Like, what is CrossFit?
So I think the like thing floating
Thrusters?
around in their heads and the things they're saying is that the argument is that a bunch of like CrossFit officers got together at the Pentagon and just like threw all their ideas into like the witch's brew and stirred it together and out popped the ACFT. I I do think there's like weird concerns around that. Like I've never seen a hex bar in a CrossFit gym. I've never seen a backwards overhead medicine ball throw in a CrossFit gym. I don't think I've even seen very much sled dragging outside of like competitive CrossFit. CrossFit traditionally underemphasizes aerobic capacity. We just talked about that in an episode that will have come out 2 weeks before this. There's a lot of red flags that suggest the ACFT is not that aligned with CrossFit methodology, but it's the idea in people's head that like any type of fitness that isn't single modality, like
Hmm.
if it's not bodybuilding, powerlifting, or marathon running, it must be CrossFit is like what's in people's heads. And that's kind of a huge compliment to CrossFit.
I think it's less a compliment to CrossFit and more just like, again, I'm not like an ass, but like you're an idiot.
That's
Like if
fair.
you think that like the best way for you to be a like high performing tactical athlete is to just do one thing. I'm not gonna like I have a 3-year-old. I'm not gonna talk to her about physics. Like she doesn't understand. I'm not gonna talk to somebody who thinks that they should train just by doing bodybuilding because they don't understand.
Isn't the I thought about this line as I was like trying to convince myself not to get involved in the comment section of my
I should get
posts, but
involved.
it's
Yeah, maybe I'll get in the comments more and just be a
that
dick.
you can get involved more, I'll get involved less, it'll be great for everybody. But the quote I kept thinking about was like never wrestle a pig because like
It's
all that's gonna
fair.
happen is you're both gonna get dirty and the pig's gonna enjoy it.
Yeah, that's actually really, yeah, it's beautiful. And pigs are strong.
Yeah, they're I mean, we learned this in the Jesse Graff episode. Lots of callback references.
There you go. Just looping it all together. Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, dude, that to me, like people that just knock CrossFit, lowercase c or capital C, like what you're knocking is a multimodality level of fitness. Like typically it's a
Sure.
power lifter who's pissed off because somebody can run faster than him, or it's a
And this is
runner
the
who's
this is the
pissed
real
off
conversation.
that somebody is stronger than him. It's like,
I think that's where most of the comments are coming from is
yeah, it's
I
like,
think they should remove the test events I'm not good at.
exactly. Here's an
Yeah,
idea. Get off Instagram and go do something that you suck at.
that's fair. I mean, that's me going to the pool. We just talked about
Yeah,
swimming.
see? We're
Yeah.
solving all kinds of floating averages and just telling people to shut up.
I don't know how long we've been talking here.
Probably too long, but we can keep going.
Probably. I'll knock out. Actually, I just want to go on a brief rant. I'm going to go on a rant.
Please. I've done many of them, so go for it.
And I'll provide the background story of this. I don't remember the guy's name, but after one of my Army Times articles got published, I got a bunch of emails from various people, some supportive, some disagreeing with me. Lots of good dialogue. I intentionally put my email address in my little bio at the bottom of it so people could reach out to me. Um, a surprising number of the people who reached out to me were retired colonels. Some had really productive thoughts, some had random things to send me, some were just like, hey, thanks for writing that thing. It was good, whatever. Cool stuff. One, and I went back and forth with this guy for a while, and it did come out later that some of this was like misplaced anger because he was going through some life issues and was stressed out and stuff like that. But his opening email to me was this like pretty unhinged screed about like there's no science behind the ACFT. This was completely made up by a bunch of like CrossFit bro officers.
This
Like
is
it's
a
stupid. It's
kernel.
harming the force. This is a retired colonel
Oh, sick.
sitting on his couch, just angry about stuff. I don't know, but I've heard that line before about like there's no science behind this, or the science behind it said we shouldn't have the run. Also not true. The science behind it said like people will say that the science said whatever the thing is they are thinking. And I know that most of these people haven't bothered to go back and read the science, but I want to just rant real briefly. I have been guilty a few times of saying the science behind the ACFT is the baseline soldier physical readiness requirement study, and that is not true.
That's the
And
Bispers he keeps
that's
talking
the
about, by the way.
BISPers. That's like the immediate thing that led up to the ACFT. It charts the path of some of the simulation tests and how they chose the events and things like that. But it is certainly not the whole of the body of science behind the ACFT. So over the course of the conversation with this guy, I was like, hey, man, and Drew knows I'm very bad at walking away from fights I've been invited to. When somebody wants to pick a fight, I like to have it.
Angry
So
kernels.
we went back and forth a little bit, and he said there's like no evidence for any of this stuff. I was like, well, that's a pretty bold claim to make, given how much actual stuff there is out there. So I took a few minutes and put together what I would say is a very like conservative, limited list of the like pathway of science that led us here.
Is this
And I'm
this
just gonna
long
rant.
ass timeline that you have in here?
Yeah, and I'm just gonna
Put
knock a
this,
few of these out.
put these in the
There's
show
certainly more of
notes.
this. Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes because it has links and everything, and people will appreciate that. People have known that there were issues with the APFT for a long time. We did the history of Army fitness episode with Dr. East that goes way farther back in history than this. There have been many efforts to assess how well the APFT was working. Spoiler alert, it wasn't working very well at what it was supposed to do, and to start to figure out what would be better. You can pick any start date and put it on the wall. Even like 5 years after the APFT, this stuff was already starting. But I'm going to put it at, for the sake of this little timeline, January 2008, USARIUM, which is the U.S. Army Research Institute for Environmental Medicine, published an article titled, and this is peer-reviewed research stuff, published an article titled Prediction of Simulated Battlefield Physical Performance from Field Expedient Tests, right? This is like decades before the ACFT is coming out. Not quite decades, but over a decade. They're talking about what field expedient tests would accurately predict simulations of combat, because you can't do what predicts actual combat. That's too hard. It's like impossible to study in a valid way. So we do expert informed simulations of combat, and we figured out what field expedient fitness tests can assess that. So in 2008, we're already working on building the evidence base for this test. And that's even if you like this whole list is going to ignore research that wasn't directly done by the Army. This is only studies directly done by the Army. So any research on like firefighters and police, any researchers done on Army soldiers by organizations other than the Army, any research on like the tactical field in general, any research on like injury prevention stuff not relevant to soldiers, like we're going to ignore all that and just look at Army research. So the first one was Usarium. You're going to hear Usarium a lot. The other organization you're going to hear a lot is APHC, Army Public Health Center. So then we get to April 2011. Not peer-reviewed research. It's just a news article announcing that pilot testing of two proposed alternative fitness tests, the APRT and the ACRT, were happening. Again, April 2011. We're still way before any discussion of the ACFT. December 2012. Headquarters Department of the Army publishes EXORD 041-13, directing the baseline soldier physical readiness requirement study, the BISPRs I've been referring to a bunch. For some context, this is around the same time that the Secretary of Defense announced the rescission of the ground combat rule, which opened all combat roles to women, and the DoD followed that with guidance to all the services to look at gender-neutral occupational standards. That has since caused a lot of political kerfuffle because there's a disagreement. Some people would say gender neutral occupational standards means because the Army is a physically demanding occupation, the whole Army should meet gender neutral standards. Others have said there should still be a baseline service wide test and then separate job specific occupational standards. That's just political background. But that HQDA order told the Army's research apparatus to go answer three questions. One, determine the physical demands of warrior tasks and battle drills / common soldier tasks. Two, identify whether the APFT adequately assesses those demands. And three, identify other test events that would be more predictive. So the Army has decided as of 2012 to start that analysis that ends up leading to the ACFT. January 2013, just a month later, that's the actual rescission of the ground combat rule. They were just a little bit ahead of the game. They knew it was coming. That opened all combat jobs to women. May 2013, Army assembles a subject matter expert working group to distill the list of warrior tasks and battle drills down to those that are most physically demanding, common, and critical. I already ranted about common and critical earlier in the episode. Fast forward a few more months, August 2013, all the way into September 2014. This is when preliminary ACFT tests were conducted with soldiers at Fort Carson, Fort Riley, and Fort Benning, now Fort Moore. Just a couple months after those ended, June 2014, APHC publishes Correlations Between Physical Fitness Tests and Performance of Military Tasks, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. A few months after that, December 2014, following the rescission of the ground combat rule, the DoD required the services to establish those gender-neutral occupational standards. That was officially published end of 2014. Again, still ahead of the ACFT. June 2015, APHC publishes Development of a New Army Standardized Physical Readiness Test, another report. 2017 to 2019, the U.S. Army Physical Demand Study is published in the form of multiple publications. This is a collaboration between USARIUM and APHC. And then finally, in November 2019, the final report of the BISPR study is published. I know that was long. It's going to be a lot of stuff in the show notes. You can go read those references if you want to. I really, really encourage you to at least glance at the ones that have links for them. A lot of work over a lot of years by a lot of people provides the scientific basis for some of these decisions. It was not in a vacuum. It was not a bunch of CrossFit bros at the Pentagon. I promise.
I like that explanation better though. I mean, was the APFT failing though? Like, was it actually?
It depends on what your definition is. So I'm going to ask you a question in a second, but first I'm going to say, by the measure of, was it assessing relevant components of fitness to actual combat? I think the answer is clearly, yeah, it was failing. It wasn't doing a good job.
Well, but like, when was the last time we lost a war because we weren't fit enough?
So it depends on who you ask. If you ask a lot of military historians, fitness was a huge problem at the start of every war we got into because we had lapsed on caring about it. There's some really good write-ups about the Korean War and how we had like neglected the physical fitness of soldiers, and it failed us when we needed it. You will see similar write-ups for the global war on terror, where people could pass APFTs and struggle to perform even the most basic tasks in combat. There's a quote I really love I think I might have made it into an Instagram post that I never posted. They use it in a lot of the early ACFT briefings. It was this like Intel Reserve captain. And he talks about how he never scored less than a 290 on his APFT. Usually got a 300. It was no big issue, no sweat. And then he gets to, I don't know if it was Iraq or Afghanistan, but he's like maneuvering down a creek bed with his body armor on and his combat load and his weapon. And he comes to like a 4 foot high wall, like chest high maybe, and he can't get over it. He could do a bunch of push-ups, he could do a bunch of sit-ups, he could run pretty fast, but it turned out to not be real. And I can speak from experience on this. I was one of those guys who got a 300 on all my APFTs, and I had, well, with the exception of one right after my knee surgery, but then I got back to 300s pretty quick after that. But I couldn't perform terribly well on rucking. I was not very strong at all. There was no incentive to train strength other than the fact that when I got to my first infantry battalion, they told me you are not allowed to participate in plans in this battalion until you deadlift 300 pounds.
Good for them.
So there was some good cultural stuff pushing me along the way, but there was no army-wide incentive for me to care about strength. I just didn't need to do it. I could suffer through the random 3 hour, 12 mile ruck march thing and be wrecked by it, like messed up feet afterwards, sucking for a day or two, which in reality is not a good thing because once you complete a ruck march, you were probably arriving at a combat scenario. So I knew that I didn't necessarily perform well on the things that combat would demand, but because the army evaluated me on my ability to do push-ups, sit-ups, and run, I didn't have that much institutional pressure to work on those things unless I had good leadership in place to do it, which I know that's kind of the job of good leadership is to enforce those things. And I got lucky with good leadership, but
Mhm.
it depends on your definition. So that brings me to a question, which is, and this came up in the comments, do you think the army was fitter, less fit, or no real difference between the APFT era and the ACFT era?
Fitter, but I don't think it has anything to do with the test.
Do you think it was fitter under the APFT or the ACFT?
I think just societally we've been getting less fit, and the army is a,
So you don't
and that's
think
kind
the
of what I was
test
getting
had that
at.
much impact on it?
No, and that's what I'm getting at with the APFT, ACFT question. It's like, are the tests creating soldiers that are more capable in combat, or are they creating soldiers who can better survive this shitty environment that they're surrounded by with the institutional military?
Hmm.
Because like any PT test at all will promote a culture that has to perform the test. Like if
When did you start working with the army? What year?
the army or the military,
The army.
the army, like it's been 3.5 years.
Okay,
Right?
so always in the
Yeah.
ACFT era.
Yeah. I
Um,
remember sitting in the briefs with the black, gold, silver,
mhm.
whatever, the different iterations. But yeah,
So
ACFT.
I will suggest that things have changed more than you might think they have in terms of the culture of fitness in the army from before the ACFT was
I agree with
announced.
that. No, I actually am, despite what I've been bitching about this whole time, I like the ACFT because you have this promotion of a sort of strength-ish
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
culture, which is
The army
great.
did not deadlift before the ACFT.
Sure,
Deadlifting was
sure.
not a common thing to see on military bases.
But
Now it is.
I guess what I'm getting at is I don't think changing the test solves the problem. I think it just creates someone who's more resilient against the other massive, much bigger issues that we talk about all the time, having to do
Hmm.
with the stress that the military creates. Should you or should you not even have to PCS anymore? Why does the food environment suck? Shitty leadership culture, stupid work hours, all these other things that create
Hmm.
problems that a more robust test maybe just creates a more robust human that can deal with the bullshit. Versus
I
if you
mean,
solve for the
maybe that's
bullshit,
all we can ask for from a test. Maybe
maybe,
that
and
is a
maybe
good
so,
thing.
maybe so.
You're kind of voting for the ACFT here, I think.
If the question was APFT or ACFT, I would say ACFT. If the
I would
question
say
was,
ACFT too.
would you change the ACFT? I would say yes.
Yeah, that's fair. I think we can agree on both counts there. I
Yeah,
think the fact that the ACFT successfully introduced like much more widespread resistance training and carrying about strength
hmm
to the army is a good thing. I
absolutely.
think I think the amount I think the APFT and people are going to be surprised by this because I'm a little bit of a runner dude and things like that.
You're a
I
swimmer now.
think I think the APFT run standards might have been artificially a little fast, just based on comparing them to historical standards. Those were the fastest run standards the Army has seen. I know we talk about like physical culture and like the World War II era and what was tested during that time. A lot of other things were tested, but if you compare run standards under the APFT to any other era in the Army's history, those were the fastest run standards we have had.
Good.
Um, Now, I do think that's good. I think the ACFT swung the pendulum a little bit too far in the other direction. But I think all of this comes back to what you were saying previously, Drew, is that there is no perfect test and no perfect standard. I think we give up on trying to come up with exactly where the benchmarks for certain scores should be and go to the floating average thing we were discussing before, which that solves the problem
Solves so many
like trying to
problems.
come up with arbitrary how fast should you be, how strong should you be.
Listen, CrossFit dudes at the Pentagon who create these tests, if you guys are listening, I'm happy to explain how the statistics would work on that Z score situation because that would be sick.
We've talked this, and I've already told Chris Frankel we'll do an episode with him talking about his TSAC presentation about different purposes of an assessment because he does it really well. He has different like types of assessments and stuff. He did a brilliant job. I also will shout out Andrew Thompson here, who we've had many conversations about the concept, and I think I've had this conversation with you too, Drew, of like, wouldn't it be awesome if we figured out what components of fitness we needed to measure and then had like a menu of different test events in those components of fitness, and it was either like selected by commanders based on the needs of their unit, or it was just like in a hopper, like randomized. You don't know what test you're going to
I
take.
don't think that would work because you'd
I
have
mean, it wouldn't hold up to legal complaints for
no, but like
sure.
one commander would be like, "Oh, we're gonna fucking run," and then another one would come in. Like it would change. You can't put okay here. Hot
I think
take.
some
You
change would be good though,
cannot.
because I had this conversation with like even Dr. East.
I don't
Like,
think you
wouldn't it
can
be
put.
great if we didn't stick with this test for 40 years like we did
Yeah.
with
Oh,
the
for sure.
ACFT and
Yes.
had more of like an evolution where
Yes.
people got used to a certain degree of change?
I don't know how far you get though if you put that much decision-making power as pertains to fitness into the hands of commanders.
That's fair.
I think
Maybe
that's
we're
a
in an idealized world
slippery,
there.
it's
I
a
get it.
slippery slope. But at the same time, like I make that point, I also make this point of like, I don't think you get very far putting fitness-based decisions into the hands of scientists. So like,
That's true too.
where's the right answer? I don't know. Rope climbs.
What else? Do we need to talk about anything else? There's other stuff we can't talk about, but we've been on this call for a while. I don't know how long it's been.
Probably too long. Listen, I'll put a bow on it. Go watch the what's that PE documentary?
Are you talking about La Sierra High School?
Yeah, go watch La Sierra High School. That is what the PT test should be. Like
If
that's it.
you To back up what you're saying, if you go on YouTube and search La Sierra High School PE program, you'll find plenty of stuff. If you're slightly more motivated, and I'll link those YouTube videos in the show notes. Now I have to.
That's why I said it. So you have to link it.
But if you are slightly more motivated, I think it only costs like $5 or something. It's not much. The full documentary is called The Motivation Factor.
Awesome
Uh,
documentary.
and we have talked about having the guy who created it come on the podcast to talk about it, and maybe we should just do that. My biggest hesitancy with him, and Drew and I have discussed this, and I don't know if I should be saying this live on the pod, is that he's been involved in some super weird stuff other
Haven't
than
we
that
all?
project.
Haven't we all?
We're talking about butthole tanning.
There could be. I mean, he's talking about butthole tanning. We've got people in the Instagram comments saying that you shouldn't. I've never run 2 miles in combat. So like,
That's
we're
fair, which is
just
stupider.
surrounded by idiots.
That's fair.
No, but my point with that documentary, the reason I say that is because to put a bow on this, I think the right answer in Drew's world, decide on the events, fine. Have that floating standard. And then, because this is what I like about La Sierra, bear in mind, this is middle schoolers, right? It's middle school
It
or
is
high
not
school,
middle schoolers, it is
high
high
schoolers, high
schoolers.
schoolers.
But they
But
do it will throw you off because they look like Navy SEALs.
right. But the point being, this is a time where your high performers, like they literally, based on the percentile, based on the threshold you met, those were the color shorts you wore to PT
Yes.
class. And so you
Yes.
created this like, I mean, maybe this is aggressive, but this like shame-based fitness culture, like, oh,
Mhm.
you want to be those guys? You go do that thing. And I think in the military,
The standards were high.
standards
Like
are high.
to
Two
get to
hours
purple
to
shorts,
2 hours of treading water to get the blue
2 hours of training
shorts.
water, pick up a buddy who weighs the same as you and run for a mile,
It's insane.
multiple pegboard
Yeah.
ascents.
But that's
We
my
talked
point.
about Leland push-ups. Those things are nuts.
Those
I
are
can barely
impossible.
do even, I can do one, I think for sure. I'm not sure if I can rep them out like those guys were
The
doing.
blue shorts is 100. I have the print off in my office.
Is 100 Leland push-ups? That's
100.
crazy.
My point is, if we had a situation in the army where you had a floating score, you had percentiles, and then you
Yeah.
incentivized percentiles because
Yeah.
soldiers are dying for incentives to make the day-to-day better. You
Hmm.
incentivize percentiles, you solve a lot of the issues we're talking about in terms of ABCP, failing tape, like blah, 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 blah. I think that more could be done than just saying, hey, this is a congressionally mandated test. Here's the standard. Go do it.
Yeah. You're right. No argument here.
So again, CrossFit Bros at the Pentagon, as you guys are building out tests, feel free to come our way. more than happy to walk you through this.
All right.
Is that
See you
it?
next week.
Boom. Bye. Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.